Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Brendan Gleeson. I'm the Director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, which is hosting tonight's lecture by Professor Garnaut. You won't have to hear much from me. My duty now is to introduce Professor Kate Aughty, who is the Chair of our External Advisory Board and does great work for us. And including tonight, she's going to be the chair for this evening's lecture and discussion afterwards. So I'll call her on now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Two things I have to do. One is introduce our speaker and the other is to take questions and MC the questions at the end of our speaker's delivery. So keep that in mind as you're sitting there, what questions you'd like to ask, please. But before I do anything else, I'll acknowledge Wurundjeri people. This is their country. It's been their country for time immemorial, and where we are, they were, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. In relation to Professor Ross Garnaut, he doesn't need an introduction, and I've asked him if he wants me to say a bit or a lot, and he said a bit will do. He is a stellar Australian public intellectual. His work on climate change is what's introducing the young scholars of today to that particular issue. He is a person who has published in such a wide range of areas, including economics, political economy, Southeast Asia, China, social democracy, regionalisation, public policy and governance. And he asks us also to consider how we might try to manage the Anthropocene, which is a big issue for scholars at the moment, and in particular I know that Missy is turning its mind to exactly that question. Can I say this about Ross Garnaut, though? Some of you will know and some of you will not that he was there at the Crucible when Papua New Guinea was seeking its independence. He was there when the Hawke era was delivering reforms. And he was also in China in the 1980s when China itself was undergoing some of its early change. He has held many positions of great significance intellectually in our universities, and I won't list them because it would take a very long time. Can I say this? In introducing Ross Garnaut here tonight, I did my homework and read Dog Days in the library this afternoon. I just want to say that Ross Garnaut is the sort of person who is a masterful, committed communicator. He tells us that there are times when poor policy looks good and ordinary policy looks celestial. We know what that means, and we know what that was meant when he wrote it. He can produce chapter subheadings like Earning Our Luck in China and The Work of Breaking Up Monopolies is Never Done. Ross Garnaut is a person who wrote, "Capitalism doesn't work if we all of us seek to maximise our own private interests in every interaction with society," and we warm to those insights. Tonight he's here to talk about his new book, which has been co-authored, as I understand it, with Li Song, China Tests the Limits of Growth. This book will again challenge us to think about policy and change. It'll ask us to think about our theories for change, and it will invite us to know that you write a book, to deliver the lecture, think about the communication, and always, everywhere, know that participation and public participation is important, in fact pivotal. Ross Garnaut, thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I'm going to talk about China tonight, but in talking about China, I'll be talking about things with great moment for Australia and for the world. I'm going to talk mainly about China and global climate change, but there's a related story about China coming to grips with the relationship between economic growth and pressure on the environment in general. China took the world by surprise with its sustained, rapid, coal-intensive growth of the early 21st century. It contributed a majority of the growth in global coal use and greenhouse gas emissions from 2000 to 2011. This caused considerable pessimism about humanity's capacity to hold human-induced increases in temperature within reasonable limits. and it introduced new tensions into international discussion of climate change mitigation. These developments in China pushed global emissions above the highest of the many scenarios for the future that had been developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And then China took the world by surprise again. The pattern of Chinese economic growth changed towards less energy-intensive activity and less emissions-intensive energy. It's in the early stages of that change, but it's already a profound one, and that's the story I'll be telling tonight. The effects of the structural change showed up in the statistics from 2012 and have shown up more decisively in each year after that. The changes in China have again transformed expectations of what is possible in global climate change mitigation, this time in a positive direction. The same pattern of urban and industrial growth that exacerbated global warming in the early 21st century also imposed huge damage on local natural systems. The immediate impact of that was most harmful to people and most provocative to social and political stability in the form of a dramatic increase in air pollution in and near China's large cities. By 2013, these domestic environmental issues were strongly reinforcing other pressures for changes in economic policy and structure. China's new model of development improves the chances of the international community meeting the 2 degrees climate target. It is starting to slow the deterioration in local environmental amenity in China's cities. And as China shifts its own production towards sustainable patterns, it demonstrates to other developing countries that continued economic growth can be consistent with reduced pressure on the environment. The huge scale of Chinese deployment of low emissions technologies is reducing the cost of environmentally sustainable development for other countries as well as for itself. The way that the international community manages human-induced climate change will shape China's future. China's own policy will have large influence on how much damage is done to China and the rest of the world by climate change. Strong and effective mitigation in China is a necessary condition for achieving the United Nations goal to hold human-induced increases in temperature to 2 degrees. It is a necessary but not a sufficient condition, as all other substantial countries will also have to make large contributions. Chinese policy and diplomacy will influence the action of other countries. The good news is that there is now close compatibility between policies that China now favours for its own development and the policies that are necessary for China to do its fair share in an effective global mitigation effort. Chinese atmospheric science is of high quality. For more than 2 decades, Chinese scientists have been alerting leaders to the risks for China from destabilisation of flows in the great rivers, drying of the North China Plain, and increases in sea levels affecting human settlements in the coastal, commercial and industrial cities. And at least since the time when Jiabao became premier early in the century, the National Academy of Science has had direct access to the Premier on these issues. The Premier has chaired a committee of scientists on climate change. China's leaders are aware that China shares with Australia and all other countries in the Asia-Pacific region an interest in avoiding the international political instability that would emerge from the impact of unmitigated climate change in Southeast and South Asia. However, it's only relatively recently that Chinese leaders have absorbed into policy formation the increasingly important reality that Chinese domestic and diplomatic actions are major determinants of the success of global climate change mitigation. A new model of economic development has been emerging in China over the past half-dozen years and was influential in the 12th five-year plan covering 2011 to 2015. Over the past 2 years, it has been elaborated by President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang, and endorsed by the 18th Conference of the Chinese Communist Party in 2012, the third plenary meeting of the 18th Central Committee in 2013, the March 2014 National People's Congress, and subsequent meetings of the State Council. Structural change that is necessary to sustain good economic performance, as defined within the new model of economic growth, will provide sound foundations for major reductions in the trajectory and soon the absolute level of Chinese greenhouse gas emissions. Despite its huge population, China contributed relatively little to the increase in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution up to the time the United Nations meeting in Rio de Janeiro made human-induced climate change a major focus for international cooperation. At the time of that Rio meeting in 1992, the average Chinese emissions of greenhouse gases were less than for the world as a whole, and the average historical contribution much less. I recall discussing these issues with the then Chinese Minister for Environment around the time of the Rio summit. China recognizes that there is a substantial global problem, he said, and recognizes that it must be part of the solution. But the solution of which it is part has to be a fair solution. And it wouldn't be fair if Chinese emissions per person were restricted to less than the average of the world as a whole. That seemed at the time to be a reasonable response. It still seems reasonable. But the success of Chinese development over the past 2 decades changes fundamentally the implications of the principle articulated by the minister. Chinese emissions per person are now well above the average for the world as a whole. The rapid economic expansion in China in the 1990s was accompanied by big reductions in the energy intensity and emissions intensity of production, as an increasing role for prices in resource allocation caused energy to be used more efficiently. Large reductions in emissions intensity in China encouraged complacency about long-term trends in global emissions. Those developments in China, the use of markets which reduce the profligate use of energy, which are developed under central planning, were fundamentally important to the IPCC wildly underestimating global emissions growth in all of its scenarios developed in the late 90s and early this century. The falls in emissions intensity in China in the 1990s turned out to be once-for-all changes. Chinese greenhouse gas emissions grew strongly in the first 11 years of the new century for 3 reasons. Economic growth was stronger than ever, an average of about 10% per annum. The improvement in energy efficiency stopped, and the emissions intensity of energy used remained high as coal maintained and even enhanced its position in energy supply. China became the source of more than half the increase in global greenhouse gas emissions, even more for a while after the Great Crash of 2008. Soon after the Great Crash, reinforced the role of state-connected investment in the Chinese economy and slowed growth in the old developed countries. China accounted for 86% of the total world increase in consumption of coal from 1990 to 2011. China's coal combustion and electricity generation increased at a compound rate of over 11% per annum from 2001 to 2011. Extraordinary expansion in steel and cement production contributed to total coal use growing even more rapidly in the first decade of the century at a compound rate of nearly 13% per annum. That, incidentally, is the cause of the Australian resources boom and the exceptional prosperity that gave us our salad days, the great Australian complacency of the early 21st century, and with the change in China's model of growth in 2011, has put us into the dog days. I'll just illustrate with a couple of charts the crucial role that China played in global use of energy and of coal in the first 11 years of this century. First, total energy. The Chinese line is the purple line. The greenish line is the total primary energy demand outside the OECD, basically the developing world. And you can see from the slope of the lines that China is most of the increase in energy demand in the developing world from about the turn of the century. You can also see there that the OECD countries, the developed countries, have actually had a reduction in energy use since the great crash of 2008, and that's stabilized total world energy use, despite the fact that developing country energy use will continue to grow, although less rapidly after the great crash. Now, to see China's role in global coal consumption, this next chart shows in pink coal consumption everywhere in the world other than China, and the red is coal consumption in China. It actually started to flatten out in 2012, grew much less rapidly, but you can see that most of the growth in global coal use, which is the source of most of the growth in global greenhouse gas emissions, was in China from 1990 onwards, but particularly from the early years of this century. The increased Chinese coal use and emissions was one consequence of a brilliantly successful economic growth strategy that greatly increased the living standards of the vast majority of Chinese people and underpinned China's emergence as a great economic power. These years from 2000 to 2011 were the years in which China became the second biggest economy in the world, having been well down the list early in the century, in which its living standards reached the levels of a middle-income country. It left the low-income countries, and this growth took it right to the edge of being as large in production of goods and services as the United States. And the official agencies, the World Bank and the IMF, expect China this year or next to become a bigger economy in production of goods and services than the United States. The successful strategy was built on an unprecedentedly high investment share of expenditure, an unprecedentedly high profit share of income, and the other side of that coin is unprecedentedly low wage share of income, exceptionally low proportions of expenditure on consumption and on services, and great pressure on domestic and global environmental amenity and stability. After the first half-dozen years of the new century, the Chinese government and people began to reassess the old growth model. While it was widely recognized that the old model had generated large benefits for the Chinese people, its success had created the need for change. Developments in the Chinese labour market were in any case generating pressures for change. The deceleration of growth and then decline in the work-age population interacted with continued strong growth in demand for labour to generate shortages of labour in major coastal cities from about 2005 and then more broadly through the economy. Wages have grown more rapidly than the economy since the great crash of 2008. This was bound eventually to put downward pressure on the investment share of expenditure. So the Chinese economy was going to change even if the authorities hadn't responded with policy. Meanwhile, higher incomes for most Chinese brought increased sensitivity about inequality in incomes and access to services. They also made room for increased concern about environmental amenity. The damaging effects of carbon pollution on health and longevity became more important in public discussion, reinforced by scientific evidence that greater environmental degradation associated with more intense use of coal and other fossil fuels contributed substantially to lower life expectancy in parts of China that used them most intensively. And there's one bit of scientific work that was particularly influential in crystallizing this as an issue in China, and that was publication in the Proceedings of the US Academy of Science, the product of some joint work of US and Chinese scientists looking at differences in life expectancy north and south of the Huai River, which is basically the borderline between areas that use coal very intensively and less intensively. And the difference in life expectancy was about 5.5 years, life expectancy at birth. And the scientific study published in the Proceedings of the US Academy of Science suggested the biggest cause of this was the particulate pollution, carbon pollution associated with the coal combustion in the north of China. So these changes in priorities encourage new domestic policies to increase services available to low-income Chinese everywhere, and especially in the countryside. New regulations were developed to protect the domestic environment. China at the United Nations conferences at Copenhagen in 2009 and Cancun in 2010 made strong commitments to change the relationship between economic growth and greenhouse gas emissions. It advised the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that it would reduce the emissions intensity of economic activity by 40 to 45% between 2005 and 2020. The new model of economic growth made the achievement of this objective possible. The new model of economic growth envisages decline in the investment share of expenditure and increase in the consumption share, especially consumption of services. It is built on expectations of a decline in the labour force and slower growth in the capital stock, leading to overall growth being several percentage points lower than in the first decade of the century. It envisages market-oriented economic reform to increase the productivity with which resources are used, with the potential to offset some of the fall in the growth rate. The focus on increased productivity includes efforts to reduce the amount of energy consumed in producing each unit of economic output. The new model of economic growth contains strong commitments to expansion of public services and social security provision, especially in rural areas. And social services, health, education, income transfers to rural areas don't use much energy. The new model embodies a wide range of interventions to reduce domestic and international environmental damage from continued economic growth. Many of the structural changes embodied in the new model of economic growth have large and favourable implications for greenhouse gas emissions. A fall in the investment share of expenditure can be expected to reduce emissions. The government has not quantified its ambition for reduction in the investment share, and the link is that investment uses several times more metals and energy per unit of expenditure than consumption and expenditure on services. Simple economic arithmetic tells us that the fall in the investment share could be large. A step down from 10% per annum growth to 7.5% would reduce by 1/4 the absolute level of investment if capital output ratios remain constant. The aim of the Chinese government is for the fall in investment to be replaced by an increase in consumption, especially of services. The fall in the trend rate of growth in economic output from around 10% in the decade to 2011 to 7 to 8% since then itself reduced the rate of increase in emissions. So far, there's not been any significant fall in the investment share of expenditure despite the lower rate of growth. That's a worry for economic strategy, but it's a strong point for emissions reduction. That reduction in metals and energy intensity associated with a big fall in the investment ratio is still to come in the future. After a slow start in 2011, the fall in energy intensity is now proceeding rapidly. In 2012, an improvement of 4% in energy efficiency was, with the United States and Russia, at the forefront of global achievement. There was a similar reduction in 2013. The eventual fall in the investment share of GDP will extend the decline in energy intensity. There have already been remarkable reductions in emissions intensity in electricity generation since 2011. This has been achieved both through energy efficiency measures and through the substitution of alternative sources of electricity for coal. In China, as in many countries, electricity generation accounts for more emissions than any other activity. Moreover, decarbonisation of electricity generation can provide a path to radical reduction of emissions in transport through electric trains and automobiles and some industrial processes. I've got a couple of tables that summarise the changes in the electricity sector. First, electricity generation by source in terms of million megawatt hours. Now these are big numbers. Anthony from the Climate Authority might be able to help me, but Australia's total capacity is about 45 gigawatts of electricity generation. Multiply by that by the hours in a year, and you get numbers. But these are very big numbers. But I draw your attention first to the dominant role of thermal power, thermal including burning of coal in 2010. Still a very large share in 2013, and in my hypothetical calculations for 2020, still high. But note the extraordinary rate of increase of all of the zero-emission sources of energy. Hydroelectric, the big one, but growing more slowly than the others. Nuclear, number two, early in the period, but overtaken by the very rapid growth of wind. Most rapidly growing of all, solar. And in the next table, I've converted that into growth rates. All of the zero-emission sources of energy growing very rapidly in the recent past. Hydro, uneven growth because it depends on the seasons, how much rain falls in the Himalayas and snow falls in particular years, but on average strong. Nuclear, rapid, set back a bit by reaction to Fukushima, which led to a tightening of safety standards and a review of programs, but then a continuation of strong programs. Very rapid growth in both wind and solar, with solar the standout. In developing the hypothetical average increases for the period ahead, I've worked on official documents, of which there are many, and official commitments to investment, official targets, and I think they are cautious. In the case of wind and solar, they're already starting to look excessively cautious because the Chinese government has again upgraded in the last couple of months its targets for growth in wind and solar energy consumption. So there are two big stories there. One, a slowing down of growth in electricity consumption. That 15% in 2010, 12% in 2011. It's more or less the average of the first 11 years of this century, coming right down to 5 to 7, 2012, 2013, and there are good reasons to expect it to continue to fall, and I've got it averaging 4% per annum up to 2020. And then of this much lower growth in electricity generation, an increasing proportion, and eventually the overwhelming proportion of that coming from low emission source of energy. Now, thermal is not only coal, and here I've brought together information on different sources of thermal energy, including gas, biomass, cogeneration. And in the two right-hand columns, I work that back to a residual for coal generation of power, which steps down to a very low rate of growth from 2013 onwards in actual coal-based power generation. But China is becoming more efficient in its use of coal, so it's getting more power out of each ton of coal. And when you take that into account, I anticipate the actual use of coal in power generation to be lower in 2020 than it is today. So you can see the trends starting to change already, and a careful working through of the information available from the planning agencies, the main policy agencies, investment decisions and commitments, plans that have been made to put aside land for renewable and nuclear energy production gives you, as a residual, that really the stabilization, the beginnings of a decline in coal use. And in the next table, I've done the same thing as in table 1A and turned all of that into percent per annum growth rates, a small decline in annual use of coal, tons of coal used in power generation. Of all the data I've put up, the uncertainty is probably greatest about gas use, because there's quite a lot of uncertainty about China's own domestic gas resources. It's investing heavily in exploration for conventional gas and unconventional gas, both shale and coal. They've had some big discoveries of shale gas, but also some disappointments. The geologists tell me that great weight on the edge of China, the Himalayas, has squashed a lot of the geological structures, and they can't contain as much gas as similar structures in other places. But that's only part of China's part of the source of China's growth in expected growth in gas demand. They're putting very big effort into developing channels for the import of gas across most of its borders, Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. It's either developed or is developing gas pipelines. It happens to be a gas-rich area, all that area around the Chinese border. And it's investing heavily in LNG import facilities and then pipeline facilities to connect that to gas use through coastal China to allow greatly increased imports of gas from Australia, Papua New Guinea, the Middle East, Indonesia, and they expect and hope increasingly North America. If China is able to succeed in implementing its new model of economic growth, I think the numbers that I've put up with the stabilization, the beginnings of fall of coal use, are conservative numbers. But China's success in implementing the new model is not assured. A big economic change on the scale that's occurring in China is difficult everywhere, and it's difficult even with an authoritarian political system. The Chinese government faces pressures from special interests to desist from changes. Large structural changes associated with uncertainty and implementation of the new strategy may cause short-term problems that introduce pressures to retreat from new directions. But while the new model of economic growth faces many challenges, the problems for Chinese prosperity and political and economic stability from pressing ahead will be much smaller than the problems that confront China if the new policies fail. And that's obviously the judgment of the government and the high-profile anti-corruption campaigns being led by the General Secretary of the party are an indication of the seriousness of the Communist Party in confronting the resistances to the changes that need to be made. We have to say that while nothing is certain until it's over, when we're looking at changes on this scale, so far so good. And I've already mentioned that some recent official statements have been in the direction of greater ambition in the rate of change, in particular in the use of wind and solar energy. Electricity is only part of the story, but there are similar changes occurring throughout the economy. Apart from electricity, the other big source of coal use and emissions growth has been the industrial sector. Others have suggested that the new model of growth is as favourable to containing emissions in the rest of the economy as it is in electricity, and I make reference to a couple of papers on the Chinese economy in the written form of the lecture that you can explore. And it seems to me plausible that emissions reductions associated with the new model of economic growth will be as great or greater in other sectors than they are in electricity. And the opportunities in other sectors are as large as they are in the electricity sector. China accounts for over half of global steel production, over half of global cement production to highly coal-intensive industries. So changes in the investment share of GDP, focus on energy efficiency is going to lead to substantial modification of the role of those industries in the economy. And I've already referred to the way in which the objective of reducing the investment share of the economy will have large implications for use of coal in industrial purposes. Transport is the other big source of emissions, and these have been growing rapidly, but are likely to respond strongly to new incentives and opportunities to reduce emissions intensity. The huge investment in intercity fast trains and urban commuter rail over the past half-dozen years, as well as the tendency towards high density of urban settlement, makes Chinese transport systems more like the environmentally frugal European and other East Asian patterns than the extravagant North American and Australian models. Truck and passenger motor vehicle traffic are growing rapidly, but now have been exposed to regulatory controls on emissions and on the use of private cars in line with the most severe amongst developed countries. And this is occurring at a relatively early stage of development before the automobile fleet has reached anything like its mature size. And China is seeking to build a leading position in deployment and production of the electric automobile. The government has announced an objective of having 5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2020. The provision of producer and consumer subsidies make it likely that this target will be met and, I think, exceeded. This will place use of electric vehicles in China well ahead of the developed countries. Chinese electric vehicle production will benefit in advance of other countries from the cost reductions which come from large scale. This will contribute to acceleration of the use of electric vehicles in China and other countries. Greater energy efficiency in electric vehicles assists in reduction of emissions from the beginning, even while the carbon intensity of electricity is high, and as the electricity system is decarbonised, of course, the emissions reductions from use of electric forms of transport are magnified. So I expect that there will be gradual normalisation of China's unusually prominent position in emissions-intensive industrial production over the next decade, and a transformation ahead of that in developed countries in emissions from the transport sector. Declining coal use in industrial activity and the marked slowdown in growth of coal use in power generation are the main forces behind the decoupling of coal use from output growth that is already evident in the data. And I've got two figures here that demonstrate that, although it is early days, it is a matter of so far so good, and there's already considerable progress. The blue line is GDP in China, continued to increase. Because that's not a logarithmic scale, it looks like it's a straight line going up, even though the rate of growth is falling. Economists used to these graphs will understand that, but take my word for it, the rest of you. The red line is coal use until about 2000 until about the time of the great crash of 2008. Coal use grew at a similar rate, a bit more rapidly than GDP. It began to grow significantly less rapidly than GDP after that. And remarkably, in the first half of this year, in data that's just come out in the last week, it seems that there's been a small absolute fall in coal consumption. So we've had a decoupling of GDP growth from coal use. And figure 4 has the same data in annual percentage growth. There you can see the decline in the GDP growth rate and the much faster rate of decline in coal use. Well, China's contribution to reducing global emissions goes beyond what's happening in emissions within its own border. There is a very important global effort to develop the technologies that allow this decoupling of growth from greenhouse gas emissions to go further. The main new science, fundamental science that's driven that has come from the United States, Germany, Japan, the developed countries, some in solar from Australia. I think that the University of Melbourne is self-confident enough not to mind me mentioning the exceptional contributions of the electrical engineering department of the University of New South Wales in the solar technology that's become influential in the rest of the world. So China hasn't developed much of the brand new technologies, the scientific breakthroughs, but China's distinctive contribution has been to bring down the costs of manufacturing the capital goods, embodying low emissions technologies through large-scale deployment. This has occurred dramatically in photovoltaic panels, where manufacturing costs in some advanced Chinese plants have been reduced by 80% over half a dozen years. It's also been important for wind power generators, hydroelectric generators, battery storage, and such energy-saving devices as LED lighting instruments and high-voltage electricity transmission. Large-scale manufacturing in China is in the process of bringing down costs radically for some major components of nuclear power generators, high-speed rail, and electric cars. We'll all be able to afford all of these things if we want them, because what is happening in the manufacturing sector in China is bringing down the costs. The photovoltaic panels is a particularly interesting story of globalization at work. A lot of the basic scientific work was done at Australian universities. PhD students in engineering study, especially at the University of New South Wales, went back to China, at about the time when European policies to promote solar power were hugely expanding demand. At first, the panels were provided inside Europe, some from the United States, but these clever young people educated in Australia found that they could manufacture these things more cheaply in China, and the larger the scale of their production, the lower the cost. So they became the main suppliers to Europe, bringing down costs. And in the last few years, as you saw in the chart on use of solar power in China, the main market has switched from being Europe to being China, and so you're getting mass deployment within China with further reductions in the costs of panels, which are then made available for the whole world. And we're beneficiaries of that. Some of the developed countries want to look a gift horse in the mouth and apply anti-dumping duties and other protectionist devices to stop low-cost solar panels coming in. I hope that we will resist that for ourselves. And China's brought down the costs of a lot of these renewable energy technologies to the extent where certainly for the supply of distant areas that are not yet connected to the big central grids, the cheapest way of extending availability of power is not through extension of the grid, but through decentralized provision of power from renewables. And that is how the electrification of rural China will be completed. China's example that it can be done, and China's bringing down of the costs, is already starting to be influential in other parts of the developing world, most importantly in South Asia and Africa. And with the election of President Modi in India, we've seen the Indian government commit itself to a similar pattern of rural electrification based on rapid expansion of solar power. That would not have been possible without the cost-reducing innovations in manufacturing that occurred in China. So China's contribution to introducing economically attractive alternatives to duplicating old emissions-intensive electricity, transport, and industrial systems in the new developing countries may turn out to be as important to the global mitigation effort as the rapid change in the trajectory of its own emissions within the new model of economic growth. So in the first 11 years of the century, China was a problem for the global mitigation effort. It did lead to the busting of all the IPCC emission scenarios, led to some pessimism about the prospects for international cooperation on mitigation. China put on the table at Copenhagen and Cancun the most far-reaching commitments to reduce emissions of any country. Its commitment to reduce emissions by 40 to 45%, emissions intensity, emissions relative to GDP, was a bigger change even than President Obama's minus 17% for the United States, and much bigger than Europe's unconditionally minus 20%, conditionally minus 30%. But the value of what China put on the table was not recognized. It was not pushed by the Chinese, and that was a diplomatic failure. And it was not recognized and brought to account by other countries, and that was a diplomatic failure. I think we might have had a different dynamic at Copenhagen if the developed world had recognized the importance of what China was committing itself to. I knew from discussions within the Chinese leadership at the time that what Premier Wen Jiabao had the State Council approve for the Copenhagen meeting was controversial in China. A lot of the econocrats wondered how China was going to do it and wondered about the wisdom of making such a commitment when you didn't know how you were going to do it. Well, China made the commitment, and as you can see from this and other things, is exceeding that commitment. Tremendously important that as we move towards the critical meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at the end of 2015, the meeting in Paris, that these changes in China that I've been talking about are properly brought to account. This means adjustments in Chinese and in the rest of the world's diplomacy. China's taken quite a while to get used to the fact that it is a great power. In earlier climate change discussions, its main goals seemed to be defensive, to try to get others off its back, and it wasn't seeking to shape things, even though it saw that for its own purposes, strong outcomes were tremendously important. And the rest of the world wasn't in a position where it could readily recognize the importance of changes in China when they were announced. Well, we've now got another chance. Developments in China make it possible for the world to achieve the 2 degrees goal that we all agreed at Copenhagen. When a few years ago one would have thought it was beyond reach, if for no other reason than the momentum of emissions growth was so strong in China. It's a great challenge for us to make sure that the developments in China are properly brought to account in the Paris meeting and the series of discussions leading up to that. Big developments are now possible. The 2 degrees is now possible. Possible because of what's happened within China, and this is the beginning of big structural change that will keep on going. Possible because China's made a big contribution to lowering the cost of low emissions technologies everywhere, and most importantly, has demonstrated to other developing countries, which are expected to be, under business as usual, the source of most of the world's emissions growth in the next several decades. It's demonstrated to them that you can reduce emissions while maintaining strong growth in living standards. Thank you.
Recent news reports say that Shanghai Electric is investing together with the Commonwealth, Australian Commonwealth and Victoria, in the Latrobe Valley in briquettes manufacturing and research. What do we make of that?
China, like Australia, is a big, diverse economy and polity with many actors, and Shanghai Electric is obviously interested in seeing whether in a future in which it will be using substantial amounts of coal, but the old patterns of growth in coal consumption have changed radically, won't be reproduced, but China will still be a substantial user of coal for some time. And I imagine that they're looking at whether they can supply their carbon needs more cheaply. Now, I think that from an Australian perspective, one has to be aware that with this big change in trajectory of Chinese growth in demand for coal, and growth in Chinese demand is most of the growth in world demand in the last 20 years, as I said, 86%. Australians should be aware this is very risky investment. China began to lower the rate of growth of consumption of coal from 2011 at roughly the same time as our enterprise started gearing up for much higher investment. Already we've seen the writing off of very large amounts of investment since 2011 in coal production. That's a waste of superannuation assets of ordinary Australians. All that money's tax deductible even if it's wasted, and so it's one of the reasons we've had big reductions in corporate tax, income tax revenue. I hope that Shanghai Electric and their partners in the Latrobe Valley have done their sums properly and they don't waste a lot more money the way that money's been wasted in the last 3 years.
Candidly. There's another question here, I'm sorry, and then we're over to you.
Yeah, Ross, it seems to me that China is tweaking rather than challenging full-on the growth paradigm, because as you mentioned, they're talking about going from, let's say, 10% growth to 7%. But on the other hand, over the last few decades, there have been a growing number of scholars, including economists, such as Herman Daly, who was with the World Bank, and John Bellamy Foster, who's a very well-known environmental sociologist at University of Oregon and the author of The Ecological Revolution, who are basically saying perhaps we need to move to a zero growth, net zero growth economy. Obviously, there are people in the world, including in China, that need growth. But there are sectors of the world, particularly in the developed world, perhaps that need to have degrowth, and that we need to maybe not only deal with the growth issue, but the social justice issue, and move to creating an even playing field, because we now have a world where growth has become extremely concentrated at the top, growing number of billionaires, not only in the developed world, including Australia, but also in places like China and India. So how would you grapple with some of those questions? Do we need to move beyond the growth paradigm?
I think we've got to be very clear and careful with what we mean by growth. I think of it as growth in living standards. There are a lot of poor people in the world, and despite Joe Hockey, some in Australia, for whom higher standards of living are still very important. And so I think the critical objective should be to break the link between growth and pressure on the environment rather than ending growth itself. You can have growth that's consistent with steady improvement of environmental conditions. And a lot of, just compare Japan in the 70s with Japan today. Its average output per person has increased several times, but its pressure on its local and global environment in many ways has diminished because it's spent its money in different ways on different things. And there are lots of ways in which you can have a higher standard of living without increasing pressure on the environment. Certainly without the pressures I've been talking about, you can de-link economic growth from coal consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. The important thing is that we've all got effective policies for doing that, and the problem is that not enough is being done in enough countries to do that, and Australia's step backwards is very unfortunate from that point of view. Hopefully it's only a temporary step backwards. But that's the critical thing, to change the relationship between growth and pressure on the environment rather than to stop growth. We need growth for a lot of reasons. You might think it's good news, but different people would have different views on it, but there's been almost no growth in consumption in the developed world since the great crash of 2008, and Australian living standards will probably decline over the next 7 years.
Over here.
Yeah, thank you. You've sort of answered my question. I just read in yesterday's Australian that the agenda for the G20 meeting in Brisbane, Joe Hockey wanted to promote growth, and I thought you could sort of put some more things on the agenda like solar energy and global population reduction and things like that.
Well, I think the climate change issue is a natural issue for the G20. This is a global problem of great importance for all large economies. We need international cooperation, and the G20 contains all the countries that are most important to solving the problem. So it's a natural G20 issue. Climate change has been a big issue in the G20 a number of times in the past. We have the 2 degrees objective because it was first discussed in the G20 some years ago, I think at the British meeting back in 2008. Now, our government is somewhat embarrassed about talking about climate change, and one can understand the embarrassment. But other governments are making it quite clear that this is an important issue, that if the leaders of Japan and China and the United States and Germany and Britain and Russia and India and Indonesia are all getting together, and Brazil, they need to talk about climate change. They're making that quite clear. Graciously, they're not doing it publicly, but they're making it quite clear privately, and therefore climate change will be discussed. And so as not to embarrass the Australian Prime Minister, it will be discussed under the heading of energy efficiency.
We'll call this a candid evening with Ross Garnaut, will we? Yes, thank you.
I think you've just sort of answered my question in a way. My question here was, what is the fundamental difference between our current leadership, if that's the word for it, and their take on science? We don't even have a science minister in this current government. Why is that? Where is that fundamental disconnect coming from? Do you have any insights to why?
Well, I don't think you can say it's some unique failure of Australians, because we always have had a science minister back to 1931. So we normally have a science minister. It's not about us. Now, we do have some peculiar attitudes to science, especially climate science, but not only climate science within the current government. I hope that that's temporary. How do you explain it? Well, I think we got ourselves in this position through a whole series of political accidents. But that's too big a story to go through here.
Thanks, Ross. The gentleman there, and then you, John.
You mentioned earlier that there are multiple uncertainties when it comes to China's energy transition. Can you please share some more information about that?
I missed the beginning of the comment.
You mentioned earlier that there are multiple uncertainties when it comes to China's energy transition. Can you please share some more information about those uncertainties?
Yeah. Well, the most important thing that China's done for the development options of other developing countries is bring down the costs of the capital goods necessary for renewable energy and low emissions energy production through large-scale deployment. China's good at large-scale manufacturing, and it gets better when it applies its skills in a large way. A lot of the reductions in photovoltaic costs by 80% over half a dozen years have come not through new science, but just many small improvements in the way goods are manufactured. For example, you use a lot of some expensive metals, copper and silver, in photovoltaic panels. Well, one plant that I visited in South China, and I visited them a number of times, and they've explained that progressively over a number of years they've reduced the amount of metal they have to use by 80% just by doing things in slightly different ways. Economists call it learning by doing. There's a very large reduction in costs associated with that, and similar things have happened across all of the low emissions technologies. For example, the huge scale of engineering investment in hydroelectric in China is reducing the costs of generators there, and they're doing some things on a much larger scale than had ever been contemplated, like pumped hydro storage. If you've got a lot of wind and solar, they're intermittent. The demand for power might not be there when the wind's blowing or the sun's shining. Well, outside all of the big cities in China, they're putting in for 2 dams in the hills at different levels, and when the sun's shining and the demand's not there for power, or more likely when the wind's blowing in the middle of the night and the demand's not there, you pump water uphill and run it down through a hydroelectric plant. They're just demonstrating that can be done much more cheaply than had once been contemplated. And very similar things are happening in wind. Very interesting in nuclear, where nuclear plants were once the subject of batch engineering. If a plant was to be built in Japan or the United States or Britain or France or Germany once, you would have brought together a team of engineers who designed the plant, designed the main components, had them sent out to specialist engineering firms to make each part. They'd all be assembled, the plant would be commissioned, and the team would break up and go away, and when they needed another plant, they'd all be brought together again. Well, we've got such a large scale of nuclear investment that the teams stay together. And you've effectively put the main components on a continuous production run. So costs of nuclear power generation are falling rapidly. Probably the most important for rural electrification in developing countries is what's happening in solar. And President Modi demonstrated when he was governor of Gujarat that the possibilities are similar in India to what we're seeing in China, and he's committed, the Indian government, now that he's president, to a big national program. India can use low-cost panels from China, or more likely, given India's proclivities towards making things at home, it may seek to build its own industry, but the fact that China has shown how it can be done has expanded the options that other countries are thinking about. In the case of Africa, China's role in development is becoming very large, and the direct provision of funding for solar developments and renewable energy developments is substantial.
John Wiseman.
Thank you, Ross. I'd like to invite you to expand a little bit on your comments about implications for Australia, both in relation to the Australian economy and Australian public policy, or climate policy in particular. I guess firstly on the economic front, you've made some observations about implications for investment in coal and other areas of mining, and I wonder if you could expand a little on that. And secondly, on the public policy front, we still do hear some media commentators and political commentators observe that Australia couldn't or shouldn't need to act until countries such as China do act. And I wonder what your response would be to that sort of commentary given these observations. So I guess it's a general invitation to talk a bit about the Australian implications of this story.
Lots of different implications. First, implications for the structure of our economy. I think the fact that we misjudged the end of the China coal boom has been very costly to our standard of living. And Australian companies they made very big commitments, and some Australian governments made commitments to infrastructure, to expansion of coal in New South Wales, north of Sydney, and to Queensland. A large part of that has been written off, and Australian companies investing abroad, investing Australian shareholders' money abroad, have also investing in coal industry, in coal investment abroad, have also written off a lot of money. Just 2 weeks ago, with its annual report, Rio Tinto wrote down the $4 billion investment it made in coal in Mozambique down to $53 million. And that's been repeated many, many times. So that's just a waste of Australian wealth, a waste of shareholders' money. It's very hard for managers of enterprises who've been responsible for decisions like that not to think that something will turn up. And so they tend to be very critical of presentations like mine and say that I don't understand China. The reality is that China's going to go back to very strong growth of coal consumption in future. Well, I think misjudgment of what's happening in China has been very costly for Australian investors and for Australian government revenue. Now, I think we could compound the misjudgment if we didn't recognise that the world energy future is going to look very different from the past, and it will be a special tragedy if Australia failed to place itself well to use a lot of the new sources of energy simply because we are so richly endowed in nearly all of the zero-emission sources of energy, including solar. There's no developed country anywhere as richly endowed. Wind, there's no developed country as richly endowed with onshore wind resources. In due course, some of the new technologies, deep rock geothermal, wave, the southern coast of Australia is uniquely well endowed as a source of wave energy, tidal. So we could be an energy superpower in the low emissions, low carbon global economy in the same way as we've been an energy superpower in the high carbon global economy. But if we fail to recognise the way the world is changing, we'll miss out on that, and we will have compounded the damage we've done ourselves by not recognising that we were making a lot of wasteful investments in coal. Now, another set of implications of this is for the way we are positioning ourselves in the global mitigation effort. The emissions targets that Australia has put before the international community, I think, are well judged for our circumstances. And those targets are not simply to reduce our emissions by 5%, as the government is repeatedly saying. What we've committed to the United Nations to do is unconditionally reduce our emissions by 5%, whatever the rest of the world is doing, and to reduce emissions absolutely by 15% in 2020 from 2000 levels. If other developed countries are making similar efforts, and developing countries are making substantial efforts, we've differentiated there. That was a commitment, a formal commitment of the Australian government to the United Nations at Cancun in 2010. At the time, it had the support of the opposition. The opposition, which is now the government, committed itself to those same targets at the last election, but you're not hearing much about the conditional targets. There's no doubt that with what is happening in the rest of the world, in the United States, which is it's on the way to meeting its minus 17% target, that the conditional targets that are part of our commitment, the minus 15 and the minus 25, somewhere in that range, coming into play. The Climate Authority made that clear in their reports early this year. We will be breaching our commitments to the international community if we seek to run away from that and say that our commitment is only the 5%. One might say those commitments don't matter. There's no actual enforcement mechanism. But I think the cost to us in international standing and the even bigger costs to us of damaging the global mitigation effort that's so important to Australia should ensure that, or recognition of those costs should lead us to moving well beyond the 5 to the 15 or the 25 that is required by what is happening in the rest of the world.
Thanks, Ross. There's one question here.
China has seen that producing gas from its unconventional gas plays is much harder than it thought, and they say reduced its production forecast in 2020 by half. If gas is not going to play its part in the energy demand, have you got any thoughts what it means on energy security and where it would get its energy demand from elsewhere?
Yeah, the gas story is not yet a bad one for China. It has had some disappointments. It's had some good discoveries. But gas, as you saw from Table 2, is not a particularly... It's a significant part of the story, but it doesn't dominate the story. There will be substantial amounts of gas, large amounts of gas coming by pipeline over the borders from Central Asia and Russia. There'll be large quantities of LNG coming by sea from the countries that I mentioned, including Australia. There will be substantial increases in gas production within China. What we don't know is how big they will be. The difference between the sorts of expectations I put into those numbers and the most disappointing of outcomes won't fundamentally disrupt things. But if there was great disappointment on gas discovery, then it would be necessary to increase some other sources of energy. I think that the numbers I've put up for all of the low emission sources of energy are relatively conservative, and there certainly would be an opportunity for raising those. I think there'll be quite strong resistance in China to simply increasing reliance on coal if gas hopes are disappointed.
We've got time for some more questions, and I don't have any hands up. So here's one here, the gentleman in blue and the lady next in the black jumper.
Thank you. We've been hearing a little bit about the plans to start local emissions trading schemes in 3 cities of China. Is that likely to be combined with pressures to decrease the total allowed emissions for those places that are engaged in trading? And is that likely to put irresistible pressure upon Australia to stop being so stupid about emissions trading here and our contribution to some sort of global scheme sometime soon?
Yeah. Well, China's experimenting with emissions trading schemes and using the Australian model to a considerable extent. So the 7 years of my life I invested in this might not be completely wasted if if it survives in China. But 5 cities and 2 provinces with a total population of 250 million people now have operating emissions trading schemes. It is explicitly seen as an experiment, generating prices around about $10, $12 last time I looked, which indicates that it's putting downward pressure on emissions. You'd have a zero price if it wasn't putting any downward pressure. China's not putting all of its eggs in that basket. The Ministry of Finance has always liked a simple carbon tax. They think it's much more likely the revenue will all come back to the centre if it's a simple tax where provincial governments can't favour their friends in giving out free permits. I think it is not certain, but it's quite likely that over the next few years the Chinese scheme will be generalised into a national emissions trading scheme. That they will take seriously their assessments of how it's gone, how it's reduced emissions, how it's worked. But I think it's also quite likely that they will end up having a carbon tax as well. They've been ratcheting up what one might call ad hoc carbon taxes on particular carbon-intensive activities, and I think that's likely to be joined by a general carbon tax as well. There's no inconsistency between the two. They can work alongside each other. Will that put irresistible pressure on Australia? Well, I think it will just be part of the mix of pressures on Australia. Well, the position that we're in now is an idiosyncratic one. We stand alone in the developed world in moving backwards, and we've sought to take comfort in Canada's position, but Canada, while its leaders might think similar things on climate change to our leaders, it better recognises the reality of its geopolitical position, and it has said it will match the United States. When it made that commitment, it was probably hoping that the United States wouldn't do much, and in Canada, quite a lot of things are happening. British Columbia has you probably heard a lot of talk about our carbon tax before its abolition being the highest in the world. Well, actually, British Columbia was higher than us. They introduced a 20 Canadian dollars a tonne, and a Canadian dollar is worth a little bit more than an Australian dollar at the moment, carbon tax, and used 100% of the revenue to reduce other taxes. And it was so popular that there was competitive bidding at the next two elections. It's now $30 a tonne. So that it can fund other tax cuts. In Quebec, which of course has got rich hydroelectric potential, it's negotiating with California to enter the Californian emissions trading scheme, which will extend additional pressure into Quebec to reduce emissions. In Europe, of course, you've got emissions, the European-wide emissions trading scheme. In addition, you've got carbon taxes in Scandinavia, Britain, some other countries. In addition, some of them at quite high levels. And you've got all sorts of other interventions to increase emissions. Countries are making their efforts in mitigation in very different ways. The tendency is for general carbon pricing, which is economically much more efficient, to become more important in the mix over time. I guess that will be influential in the Australian public discussion. What I hope is that before the meeting in Paris, it's become so crystal clear to so many Australians that the rest of the world is doing quite a lot, that our government is able to say we were quite right to abolish the carbon price because no one else had one, but now the world is clearly acting on climate change, so now is the time to introduce one.
Did you have somebody at the back there? There is somebody. Who are we talking about? Who's got? The lady in black, if you would, and then whoever is up the back, and then the gentleman in the white shirt.
Thank you.
That's the end, I think.
You've cheered me up no end with your talk about what's actually happening. I was wondering how significant shipping is, taking resources from Australia to China and consumer goods from China back to Australia in carbon pollution, and what are the alternatives for shipping?
If you've got mountains of iron ore in Australia and steel mills in China, there's not much of an alternative to ships you couldn't take much on planes, but there are lower emissions ways of doing your shipping. In fact, the large tankers now use far less fossil fuel than they used to per unit of per ton of material that's moved. Once goods moved around the world, there was a very big trade between Australia and Britain using the renewable energy of wind. Some work has been done on supplementing in certain conditions the internal combustion engine in a ship with use of wind. Similarly, there could be some modest supplement, not much, from solar. Wind potentially more important, but probably for shipping in the end, biofuels will become more important. Biofuels are going to be quite important in land transport, but in land transport there will be a battle between biofuels, the hydrogen cell engine and the electric engine. Just at the moment it seems the electric engine's probably winning, but who knows what will happen in the long run. But for shipping and air transport, biofuels are probably going to be more important. The first steps into biofuels for transport were false steps. I chaired for a number of years the board of the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, and we did some major studies of how much damage the conversion of food-producing land into production of biofuels was doing to food security in the developing world, putting up the price of maize and other basic foodstuffs through its diversion into use of biofuels. So the future of biofuels is going to be use of organic hydrocarbons that do not compete with food for land. And I try to follow this material a bit. It seems to me that the leading opportunity, and one in which Australia is particularly well endowed, is the use of algae. Now, algae's got a track record. It converted a carbonic atmosphere that was inconsistent with mammalian life on Earth into the oxygen-rich atmosphere that we've got now. So it's done it before on a much bigger scale. It took hundreds of millions, if not billions of years last time. We can't wait that long this time. But at James Cook University and in Townsville, and a joint venture between the University of Adelaide and Murdoch University in South Australia on the Eyre Peninsula, there are two examples of what around the world are very active research in breeding superior forms of algae, separating out the hydrocarbons, separating out the oil, and I think it's very likely that we will end up having reasonably priced biofuels from sources that don't compete with food. So, long answer, but in the end, that will solve the shipping problem.
There's a question up the back, thanks, and then we'll come back to you, and we don't have time for any more after that. I think we're fine.
Hi Ross, thanks for your talk. My question is, with the pilot carbon policies that have been introduced in the provinces, how do you see leakage as a potential issue for assessing the successfulness of these programs?
Well, carbon leakage is a problem where you have an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax in one place and not in other places. And of course, if you have it in some provinces and cities in China and not in others, then there's a danger that those cities and provinces won't be competitive in vis-a-vis other provinces. And while the national government might not think that's terribly important, so sometimes the provincial governments do think that that's important. It's certainly been the subject of the leakage question, a lot of discussion within China, but I'll be attending a conference on these things in Beijing in a couple of weeks. I'll learn more then, but I don't think it has been a hot issue. I don't think it's seen as a major problem. And of course, that problem within China is solved as soon as you have a nationwide emissions trading scheme or carbon tax.
Last question, please.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that in large part the success of the Paris 2050 meeting might depend on the recognition of the world of Chinese contribution to the mitigation, joint mitigation effort. Now, remembering the confusion that arose as well among European policymakers when the 40 to 45% intensity target hit the floor about what does it mean? We don't have a GDP projection. It is beyond. It is below a hypothetical base case. It is better than the past. Is it with inflation or without inflation? The GDP, etc. Large part of that problem was the transparency of the target. So, what do you think are the chances that China is prepared to come forward with a target with reference to in a historical base here?
Yeah, well, German mathematical genius is responsible for a very large amount of what is of value in our civilization, but the pedantry associated with that can also lead to some challenges, and maybe there was a bit of that in Copenhagen, not just German. I think Australian was probably worse than most. But I think there does need to be a lot of discussion very early. And what I pin most of my hopes on is the close discussions going on between the United States and China. This is at a time of very considerable tension over geostrategic issues between the United States and China. They've found that climate change and energy policy is one area in which they can cooperate. There are frequent high-level meetings. Now, the United States policies contain some ambiguities too, and will need European and Australian indulgence at the margins. But I'm hopeful that that if the US and China can sort out what they each consider to be a reasonable step forward for each of them, that can help inform the rest of the international community.
Very quickly, yeah, we've got your hand up. Very quickly, yeah. This fella here, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I have two quick questions. And I want to just, I'm not an economist, I'm a scientist, physicist, and hydrogen-powered vehicles are a disaster. I'm reading this from Cambridge book, so I won't elaborate more, but they consume like 10 times more energy than electric motors. But I wanted to ask you just two short questions. First one was how much, what's the percentage of emissions, Chinese emissions, that go to actually industrial emissions? And do you know how much of that goes to actually production of stuff that ends up in Western countries like mobiles or whatever that is? And the other question is, short one, if we are to achieve temperature rise less than 2 degrees, it is said that we need to come down to cut the energy emissions to 65%, or about 1 ton of CEO equivalent per person. Australia currently is one of the record holders with around 27 per person. We need to achieve 1 ton per person. How is Australia going to do that?
Both of those questions, if you can answer them tonight, Ross, but otherwise you can take them as a comment.
Yeah, I probably had the numbers on the percentage of Chinese emissions in my original report, 2008. It'd be a bit out of date now. I don't have them in my head now. I would guess probably about 40% of China's emissions will be from industrial activities, and I would guess about a quarter of that is on exports, embodied in exports to other countries. So just a guess, but I guess about 10% of China's emissions. Remind me of the last point very briefly. Australia, yeah. Yes, to achieve 2 degrees, the world as a whole will have to reduce emissions by about half from current levels. There'll be no international agreement that doesn't have more or less equal entitlements per person for people everywhere. We are, as you mentioned, we are the world record holder for the developed countries, 27 tonnes per person. We'll have to come down to a couple of tonnes. In my report, I estimated we'd have to come down in absolute terms by about 90%, similar to other developed countries, even though we're higher to start with because we'll have more population growth between now and then through immigration. But have to bring down emissions by about 90%. I actually think that if we just got on with the job, had the right level of carbon pricing, the right support for investment in new technologies, we'd be able to do it. Just look what's happened in our electricity sector in just a few years of a set of policies that are putting downward pressure on emissions and promoting energy efficiency. Mike Sandiford at the Energy Institute of this university took out some sums on emissions in Victoria in the autumn of this year compared with the autumn of 2 years ago. And there's a lot more Victorians now than 2 years ago, and economic activity is considerably higher, but emissions fell by about 14%. I think we can do it without great disruption to the economy if we've got confidence in the stability of emissions reducing policies.
That really is the end of all the questions. And Missy just asked me to make sure that Ross got this bottle of wine, and we're hoping that it's a Victorian vineyard that hasn't had to move to Tasmania as a consequence of climate change. Thank you very much, Ross. Thank you for...